Hi, I'm Ryan from RTINGS.com. Today we'll be doing a review of the Gigabyte AORUS FI32U. We'll be evaluating it on our standardized test bench to see how it performs and if you should buy it. This monitor is one of the latest additions to Gigabyte's AORUS gaming lineup. It features a 32-inch screen with a 4K resolution and a refresh rate of 144 Hz. It's very similar to the M32U, but with a different design and some extra features which we'll talk about in the review. The FI32U features an aggressive design aimed at gamers. It has a large 16:9 screen with a high 4K resolution. The back of the display features chrome accents as well as controllable RGB bias lighting. The stand is quite heavy and made of metal. It supports the monitor well, but is pretty large and takes up quite a bit of desk space. There's a gap at the back of the stand for some basic cable management, which is nice. If you don't want to use the stand, then there's a quick release at the back with a standard 100x100 VESA mount. There's a wide range of inputs with 2 HDMI ports, a DisplayPort, and a USB-C port. They are both HDMI 2.1 ports, but are limited to 24 GB per second bandwidth. They use Display Stream Compression 1.2a in order to achieve the higher bandwidth requirements of HDMI 2.1 devices. The FI32U also features a microphone input, headphone and audio line outputs, as well as 2 USB 3 ports and a USB-B upstream port. Now, let's take a look at the tests. We'll start with the contrast. A high contrast ratio is important if you use the monitor in the dark for deep dark scenes. Like most monitors, this one has an IPS type panel. This has some trade-offs which we'll talk about in the review, but a big advantage is better viewing angles and fast response times. This does, however, come at the cost of contrast. Like most IPS panels, the FI32U only has mediocre contrast. Local dimming is a feature that controls the brightness of individual zones of the backlight. This allows for much deeper dark scenes in things like video games, as the area of dark objects can be further darkened. As a result, the overall contrast can be boosted. The FI32U has a terrible edge-lit local dimming feature. It is an edge-lit panel, so each of the 16 zones extend from the bottom to the top of the display. It does nothing to help the contrast and is very distracting. Now, a high peak brightness is important either in a bright room to counteract glare, or if you want brighter highlights and a more impactful image, especially in high dynamic range or HDR games. This monitor gets fairly bright. It's very consistent across different types of content and should be bright enough to combat glare in moderately lit rooms. When playing high dynamic range games, the brightness does increase slightly, but isn't enough to really make highlights pop. The local dimming feature also doesn't really help to improve the brightness or contrast significantly. Also important for a bright room is good reflection handling. The FI32U has a hazy screen coating that helps to diffuse reflections and reduce their intensity. Overall, most moderately lit rooms shouldn't be an issue, but it might be more problematic if you're directly opposite a window with lots of sunlight. A potential downside of a hazy coating is if it causes small details like text to appear grainy. Text clarity is also impacted by a bunch of factors though, like the subpixel arrangement. Overall, it's great as you can see in these images. The screen coating doesn't have much of an impact. The top photo is with Windows ClearType, which helps diagonal lines look clearer. Without ClearType in the bottom image, it's alright but does lack some subpixel detail. Note that these photos are taken with the recommended Windows scaling of 150%, which increases the size of UI elements and text. Lowering the scaling settings will affect the text clarity. Good viewing angles are important to ensure details at the far sides of the screen don't look washed out. On this monitor, the horizontal viewing angles are decent. They should be more than good enough for using the screen alone and adequate for sharing with someone else. The vertical viewing angles are good, so even if the display is mounted above eye level, it shouldn't be an issue. An overall uniform screen brightness and color is important when playing video games to avoid distracting areas that are overly dark or bright. This does vary between units, but we expect this FI32U we bought to be about typical. The overall screen has a very similar brightness, which is great and shouldn't be an issue. In dark scenes, there is some clouding throughout, as you can see in this photo. The local dimming does mean that in very dark scenes the backlight is mostly off, which improves the uniformity in those areas. However, due to the size of the zones, it does make a rather large difference in uniformity between zones that are on and zones that are off. Accuracy in the standard sRGB color space is important as it's the standard for computer use. This monitor has a specific sRGB color mode, which is pretty good as it clamps the colors for accuracy and to avoid an oversaturated image. The sRGB mode does lock you out of almost all settings, including color temperature and gamma, with the exception of brightness. If you want to take full advantage of this monitor and display vivid colors in things like high dynamic range or HDR games, then the FI32U is a good choice. A high refresh rate is important for gaming. It allows the image to be drawn on the screen faster, which makes it more responsive. And if the monitor supports variable refresh rates, then you can get a smooth experience without tearing regardless of the changing frame rate. The AORUS FI32U definitely doesn't disappoint. The 144Hz refresh rate is on the higher end for 4K displays. It is also compatible with both G-Sync and FreeSync, which means compatibility with new NVIDIA or AMD graphics cards. Just note that if you're using an older graphics card that doesn't support HDMI 2.1, you'll want to make sure it supports DSC 1.2a so you'll be able to take full advantage of 4K 10-bit resolution at 144Hz over DisplayPort. Another important thing to note is that the Sony PS5 does not currently support DSC 1.2a, so at 4K 120Hz, you'll be limited to Chroma 420 subsampling. When playing video games, a fast response time is important for the clearest image without distracting blur. The FI32U has excellent response times at its max refresh rate. We recommend the off setting for the overdrive, since the other settings all have significant overshoot. If the frame rate drops when you are gaming, then luckily the response times are still great. Stick to the off overdrive setting for the best result regardless of the frame rate. If you really want the clearest image when playing fast-paced games, then black frame insertion or backlight strobing features are useful to reduce the blur caused by persistence of the image during a full frame. The AORUS FI32U can flicker the backlight at either 120Hz or 144Hz with the variable refresh rate feature disabled. Unlike most other monitors on the market, the FI32U can use BFI and VRR at the same time. So as the frame rate changes, the flicker rate of the backlight also changes. This remains until around 80 Hz. Below that, the backlight stops strobing. This is great if your gaming system can't handle a consistent frame rate of 120Hz or 144Hz, although we only recommend it if you can keep a stable frame rate above the 80 Hz threshold. Otherwise, seeing the backlight strobe turn on and off can be distracting. Another thing to note is that there is some strobe crosstalk with the BFI feature, so you may see some slight image duplications with fast-moving objects. Now, a low input lag is really important for a responsive feel when playing video games. This monitor has a very good input lag for most casual gamers, but it is higher than the norm for a monitor with this refresh rate. Gigabyte in the past has released firmware updates that improve their input lag, so it's possible they will release one for this monitor that will do the same. So, this brings us to the main question: should you buy this monitor? Well, firstly, it's definitely an impressive package between the high resolution, frame rate, picture quality, and size. However, there are other monitors that offer very similar display specs at a lower price point. Gigabyte's M32U has extremely similar performance in almost every category, but it's significantly less expensive. The M32U, on its latest firmware, has better input lag and less crosstalk with the BFI. The only real advantages the FI32U offers over the M32U are the more premium build quality and design with the better stand, and built-in extra features like active noise cancelling for your microphone. If you plan on VESA mounting the display either way and aren't planning to use the built-in audio features, consider getting the M32U instead. If you're looking for similar performance but in a smaller form factor, consider the Gigabyte M28U. If what you're looking for is a no-compromise, high-end HDR experience, then consider the 48-inch LG C1 OLED for a more impactful HDR experience, but with a slightly lower frame rate of 120 Hz.